There have been some pretty impressive performances in bowl season so far this year, especially USC on Wednesday night in the Holiday Bowl. I don't know how many people thought that they would lose to Louisville. I kind of thought that USC would win that game, but how they did it and how impressive they were without some key players is a pretty impressive performance, regardless of how lacking they were defensively the entire season. It was still an impressive performance by USC on Wednesday night. But it wasn't so impressive, or I think it shouldn't have been so impressive, that you put aside some of the things that you saw with your own eyes this year going into next year. And every year, somebody is super overrated coming into the season. Somebody is super overrated due to the AP poll or due to, expectations of a conference preseason media poll, whatever the case may be. Somebody is in the top 10 in the end of the season. You're like, oh God, how in the hell did they get ranked that high going into the season with how the season played out? And part of that, I think, sometimes factors into the performances in bowl games. And you see it every once in a while where somebody was so impressive in a bowl game that it kind of makes you reevaluate just how you were going to view them going into next season. And I think a good example of this is, do you remember back when Matt Stafford and Noshawn Moreno were going to come back at Georgia after a really impressive bowl performance where it was like, oh gosh, was that the best team in the country right now? No, I don't think so, but they're the number one team going into next season, and they were the number one team going into next season. They didn't finish the number one. They didn't finish the season as the number one team in America. And that's not to say they weren't good. They were. But I think when you start to look at who's going to be ranked in the top 25 going into next season, part of that ranking is, okay, what do they have coming back naturally? And then two, how did they finish 2023? Did they finish strong? Did they win 5 of 6 or 6 of 7 or 4 of 5? Did they win their bowl game? Very rarely will you see somebody be that hot, trendy top pick going into the next year of like, hey, this team's going to be really good, and they lost their bowl game. Like, it just generally doesn't shake out that way. So don't let bowl performances cloud your judgment of who's going to be impressive and look really good next season. It's tempting, and it's, I think, somewhat easy to do, right? Like, it's easy to say, okay, this team played in their bowl game really well, and they got a lot coming back. It's going to be easy to pick them, rank them pretty high going into 2024. And there's just more to it than that. There are so many variables that we get in this idea that, and similar to conference championship games or whatever, we get in this idea that every bowl game is created equal. They are not. Some teams are going to get trounced in their bowl games and still be really good next season. Just half the time, it's just different circumstances. And that's all there is to it. Whether it's guys opting out to get ready for the NFL draft, guys hitting the transfer portal, coaches moving different jobs, injuries, whatever the case may be. Like Texas A&M's playing a bowl game with 55 scholarship players. That's not necessarily a fair assessment of what they were this year, what they're going to be next year, etc. There are differentiating circumstances. And that's all there is to it. Sometimes you just don't match up with somebody very well. Somebody could be a ground and pound type offense and you don't defend that very well. Or you can be a chuck it all over the place and they've got 5 or 6 DBs that are really good and can cover your chuck it all over the place offense. Styles make fights, and sometimes your styles don't match up, and that's okay. But don't get it clouded that a guy that you maybe had never heard of until yesterday throws 6 touchdown passes for USC. That doesn't propel him to a Heisman Trophy candidate stature and a potential national championship team for USC. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who will tell you USC is a contender to win the Big Ten next year. I don't think that's the case. But with how they looked last night against a team who played in the ACC championship game and gave Florida State a pretty hearty struggle, I don't know that you can look at that. It's easy, I think, to look at that as like, oh man, you know what? USC's got it figured out. Things are going to get righted. And there are, on the alternative, there is the, like, you know what? I think that proves Caleb Williams is a system quarterback. I don't think necessarily that's it either. I don't know how much you can take away from bowl game results, whether it's individually, whether it's a team, whether it's one side of the football, whatever the case may be. There's just so many variables now that it really truly is, and nobody wants to pretend that this isn't the case, but it really truly is in some aspects a scrimmage. If you follow high school football at all, in this scrimmage season, you will hear people talk about like, oh man, this team that really stinks, they beat up on this really big school that's really good. Okay, well, that might be the case, but if the other school is like, okay, we're just going to, like, we need to practice these kind of 6 plays, so we're just going to run them over and over and over again, and the other school's treating it like a game, like it counts in the standings, you have differing priorities. And there are going to be a lot of schools that have differing priorities in their bowl games. That some schools are going to treat it in that Dan Mullen, Florida getting its ass kicked against, I forget who it was, Virginia maybe? Florida getting its ass kicked in a bowl game where basically they said, hey, this is practice number 1 for the next season. And then you're going to have schools that say, hey, we came here to do this. We came here to finish this off, to put a cap on a really good season for us. We're going to treat this like it is the conference championship game. We're going to treat this like it is a rivalry game. We are going to take this incredibly seriously. And that doesn't make one side right or wrong. It doesn't make one way to approach it the correct way. It just makes them different. But you can't take a whole lot away from it when that's the case. If Missouri beats Ohio State on Friday, I don't know that you can make some big grandiose deduction out of what that means for Missouri, what that means for Ohio State. I don't think if Liberty beats Oregon, I don't know that you can look at that as some gigantic, like, oh man, what does that say about Oregon going forward? I don't think it says anything. I think it says nothing. And in a sport where we're kind of trained to react to big situations, big wins, big losses, and it's one of the downfalls of college football is you don't get matchups like you'll see over the course of the next week or so, all that often throughout the regular season. So you kind of have to make decisions. You have to make gigantic overreactions and overstatements over what happens in these games because you don't get to see them that often. And it's a classic, if we win, like, hey, that's a nice win. And if we lost, well, we didn't care about that game anyway. And I think going back to earlier this week, if you think it, say it. If you are treating this as if it is basically just 15 practices for the 2024 season, then a glorified spring game at the end of your 15 practices, then okay, say that. Just treat it as such. But don't get your asses kicked and then in the post-game press conference be like, yeah, you know, we came into this, we were looking forward to getting some young guys some experience, and like it can't, like, if that's your plan going into it, and believe me, I know that nobody wants to hear that throughout the week. You're going into the bowl game. The bowl sponsor doesn't want to hear Duke's Mayo. The Duke's Mayo Bowl doesn't want to hear that West Virginia is like, okay, yeah, we're not really trying this week. Like, it doesn't serve anybody. But if that's the case, if that's the truth, then speak the truth. But don't do it after you got your tail whipped. Don't go into it with the idea like, oh, this is a really important game for us, blah, 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 blah. And then when you get the floor mopped with you, say, well, you know, it was important for us to get some young guys, some run on defense. Like, no. If you got your tail whipped, you got your tail whipped, and that's okay. But if that's the way you're approaching your bowl game, I don't have a problem with it. They're made for TV events anyway. And I don't want to get into the worthless conversation or anything like that, because are some bowl games worthless? Yes. And nobody wants to say that, but there are some bowl games that are absolutely worthless. The idea that the Quick Lane Bowl was going on yesterday, and Bowling Green played Minnesota. And I'm not saying that game is worthless by any stretch of the imagination, but somebody used that game as this is proof to why these aren't worthless. These are experiences for the players, yada, yada, yada. Bowling Green drove an hour and 10 minutes north on I-75 to play that game. If those kids wanted to experience Detroit on any Saturday night, they could. It's not an experience. It's not a reward for Bowling Green. Boston College playing in the Fenway Bowl in Boston. You get an experience of, you get to play a football game inside Fenway Park that you were already going to do. I'm not saying that those games specifically are worthless, but to say that they are a reward for the players, etc., I don't think is necessarily all that true. Like New Mexico State got to play in the New Mexico Bowl. Okay, you made a couple hours trip to play in your rival stadium. I don't know how much of a reward that is. If you got to play a big-time opponent, if you got to play somebody you were never going to get to play in any other situation, correct. Bowling Green played Minnesota yesterday. Bowling Green played Minnesota in the regular season last year. This year, SMU was playing Boston College in the Fenway Bowl. So Boston College is playing a future conference opponent in its home city. I don't know that that's a reward for the players. I don't know that that's a gigantic, thanks for all you did for us, buddy. Is it an experience? Sure. But I don't know that it's one anybody's dying to experience. It's like going on vacation and eating like a Denny's. I don't know that, yeah, we did it, but I don't know that anybody was clamoring, pounding the table. Damn it, we want Denny's. Okay, it was there. We did it. That was cool. But going back to the original point, don't put too much stock into what you see over the past 10 days or so and now the next week or so. It's kind of fool's gold, and there's no real way to quantify it. I think it's easy to say just trust your eyes, but even those can deceive you a little bit. I don't think the young pup from USC is going to be a Heisman Trophy contender next year, and maybe he will. Maybe that was the start of greatness for 2024. But I just think it's easy to look at some results and go, holy cow, they're good, and not have the full context, the full picture of, okay, here's how that happened. And I think sometimes it's important to have that information. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Be back on Sunday. We'll recap some New Year's Six bowl games and take a look at the college football playoff semifinals coming up. Should be some good ones. We'll talk about it here on the Daily Huddle. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out here at Saturday Glory. If you are listening on a podcast, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. We'll be back at it Sunday. I'll see you then here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.